Thank you, Dave Cook, for coming to talk to us about the masonry trades. And Dave Cook is from DKC Stoneworks. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your company, that would be great.
Yeah, good morning, Mickey. Yeah, I'm Dave Cook, and I've been a masonry contractor since 1991. I started my business in 91. Prior to that, I did a 3-year apprenticeship um, with a fellow on the island. His name was Bob Blongen, but everybody called him Plum Bob. And Bob was he was 60 when I started apprenticing with him, and Bob was probably 5'4" and maybe 130 pounds. So it kind of negated the whole idea that you had to be a big, strong giant to do this trade. What Bob did was, and he taught me, was don't waste any moves. Make every move count. Anyway, I started my company in 1991 with 1 employee, and the timing was fortunate. At the time when we were just started, we would come in and do a fireplace or a planter or a little bit of stonework on the floor. The building trades blossomed during the 90s and into the 2000s. And so my company went up to 15 masons, well, a dozen masons and 2 or 3 laborers. And we were doing 3 or 4 projects at a time. 9/11 happened and it scaled us back a little bit. And then 2008, the economic turndown came and scaled us back even more. And so I finished with the company with 6 or 7 masons and a couple of laborers, and that would seem to be a much more manageable size of men and resources to work with. We've done many large projects and many small projects. It's been certainly very satisfying and fulfilling. It's also been hard work and cold and wet at times, but that's sort of the nature of work.
Well, talking about the nature of the works, could you tell us about the different types of masonry trades?
Yeah, certainly. There's 2 main branches. One is commercial masonry, and the other is sort of residential masonry. And in commercial masonry, what you see is a lot of block work. You see buildings like the Costco's being put up. A lot of sort of perimeter type fences that go around developments. And on the brick side, you see a lot of cladding of buildings. Not so much residential buildings, but big commercial buildings that have miles and miles of brickwork on them. These trades are typically all union, and you go through a union apprenticeship to work at these. The other pathway that is one that's more prevalent is residential masonry, and the projects in residential masonry range from again brickwork and blockwork and stonework, and that was pretty much where our company was specializing, was in stonework. And we did any number of types of stonework based on the type of stone what the client wanted. And that would be for fireplaces, for wainscoting, for any number of stone structures. Also in that is flooring. And so we would do a lot of slate and flagstone. And in those, it would either be modular squares and rectangle type of slate, or it would be a random bond flagstone where you would get natural pieces from the quarry and you would cut and fit them into the shapes that were the most natural. Also in residential masonry, and not entirely masonry because it's a subset, is tile work. And tile setters are part of the masonry trade, but they're a special subset off of themselves. And the way that you would proceed with in the residential masonry field would be to get a job with a masonry contractor who does residential masonry, and certainly on the island, that's typically what there is. and you would start out working as a laborer. And unfortunately, there are not really any shortcuts to becoming a journeyman mason. It just takes the time it takes. And one of the reasons it takes that amount of time is you have to be familiar with all the materials and how they work. The hardest taskmaster that we have in the masonry trade is Portland cement, and it's a critical part of everything we do. Is the mortar. And Portland cement has the unique ability is that it's not really going to wait for you. And so you have to be on your game with it, and you only have a set amount of time to tool it and finish it and clean it before it becomes a completely different material.
Could you tell me a little bit about the difference between what block work is versus stonework?
Yes, block work uses basically what are called concrete masonry units, and everybody knows it's a cinder block. And the typical one is 8 inches tall and 8 inches wide and 16 inches long. There's different sizes of blocks, and they're used to lay up a wall. We would use blocks to lay the core of the fireplace, and then we would veneer it with stone. Stonework, it can be stonework is you using natural stones and mortar to hold them in place. Now there's all sorts of different applications and looks that you can get with stonework, both depending on the type of the stone and the way it's laid. Typically, if you would see a fieldstone fireplace, which is what we see on the island a lot, that would be what would be called a rubble stonework. And there's no really discernible pattern. You're just fitting the stones as they come together. River rock would be the same thing. A lot of stonework we do is squares and rects or ledge stone, where you're laying up in a horizontal fashion with pieces of stone that are longer than they are tall. And again, there's any number of permutations on this sort of style that you would do there.
You were telling me in our conversations before about the sort of a pathway through commercial work, and that wasn't something that you necessarily recommend to people, where versus stonework as being a sort of an outlet for creativity. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I may have been remiss in telling you that I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it for me. And here's the thing of, I probably had 300 employees in the last 30 years. And what it really depends on is how each person's brain organizes space. And when I have bricklayers and block layers, they're really happy with having that sort of module component to work with. And I've had bricklayers who do beautiful brickwork, and I put them on a stone job, and they want to quit just because because things don't fit like they're supposed to. And the same token, I have stone layers that I put on brick jobs or block jobs, and they just can't do it. They can't lay to the line. They can't level plumb, and it's more how your head organizes space. For my head, I like the creativity of being able to create structures and pieces out of stacks or piles of stone that you give them the organization, you give them the structure by being able to fit pieces that are dissimilar together. Again, not to dissuade someone from going into commercial masonry, because if that's where your head works at, then that's probably where you need to be. And on the other hand, if your head is more not necessarily abstract, but it enjoys creating order out of chaos, which is kind of what you do with the stone wall, then the stonework residential masonry path would be better.
So getting into the pathways, you mentioned the pathway for residential stonework being basically to be hired on as a laborer for a company, and then going through that as an apprenticeship. Is that my understanding correct?
That's correct. In residential, you hire on, and you hire on what's called as a hod carrier or a laborer. Now, a hod carrier comes from back in the day when you carried mortar in a triangular sort of container on your shoulder with a pole, and that was what a hod was. And so either a hod carrier and they're still called hod carriers, you know, or a laborer. And then if you show aptitude and interest, most all masonry contractors will move you up the line, because the hod carriers are a support person, and they don't really put any stone in the wall, and they don't really do anything. Where that's incorrect. They do a lot, but they don't do anything to complete the finished product. And the masonry contractor is looking to train masons to you know, put stones in the wall. And so it's typically a 2-year program, just depending on what the other considerations are. But if someone has you know, really wants to work at it, then they spend a year as mixing mortar and hauling rocks and cleaning equipment and detailing stuff. And then after the 2nd year, then they're given a trowel, and then they do both jobs, you know, and they're able to you know, to learn the trade of putting stone, laying bricks, laying block, cutting stone, cleaning stone, all those things. And so by the end of the 2nd year, you wouldn't quite be a journeyman, but you'd be real close, and the pay scale goes up commensurately with your skills.
And so in the 3rd year, then that would be when you become the journeyman?
Typically, by the 3rd year, you'd be you should be able to go onto a job, and the foreman should be able to tell you to say, okay, go work on that wall, and not have to have a lot of extra supervision. And in the 3rd year, you would learn how to build a fireplace, which is sort of one of the pinnacles of the trade. And we've in the last 30 years, I you know, I don't have an exact count, but somewhere between 200 and 300 fireplaces we've built. And it is a dying trade. There's for any number of reasons. You know, fireplaces are a very important part of the trade, I think. But they're actually not necessary for a house, and they're there for ambience, and they make a house complete, is my opinion. But they are reasonably expensive, and I can't tell you how many times we've had houses that we bid on, or the general contractors bid on, and they have to go through a round of budget cuts, and the first thing they get taken out was the fireplace. But you know, and then it gets added back in. But yeah, by the 3rd year, you would be earning towards the top of the pay scale. Maybe not you know, there's still more room to improve. The masons that I had, that were the one I could give them a set of plans and walk away, and they would have their own crew under them, you know, all had 10+ years experience. And it's not that you can't learn the skills in 3 years, because you can. There's no question about that. But it's learning how to deal with different situations that come up that are non-standard, that where you really need the experience. And there's no shortcut for experience.
Are there formal training stepping stones, like licensing requirements or other things that you'd go through, or is it a more informal process that you just say, okay, I've worked with this guy for 3 years, I know what I'm doing?
Yeah. There's both. In the commercial end of it, in the union end, there's a formal apprenticeship that you go through, and I think you spend a year this apprenticeship, and you mix it up between classroom stuff and practical stuff, and then you work on jobs. In the residential end, it's more individual to what each masonry contractor does. Now there is an outfit called the Residential Masonry Association, which was started in Seattle by a fellow I know, and I was involved with it for a while in the late 90s. It wasn't applicable to be living on the island, and they were doing some training and doing some safety work and certifying contractors that they had gone through some certain steps. But typically in the residential end of the training is on site and done by the individual contractor. And the individual contractor has a good reason for training people well, because that's going to be those people that he trains well are going to be his workers. And so by spending the time in training, he's only helping himself out.
Just is there much back and forth between somebody who, like, say you have somebody here who decides they want to move to the mainland, or vice versa, and one's been doing residential or now is going to do commercial, or vice versa? Is that sort of back and forth easy between the two?
No, not typically. You know, you would have to, you know, in order to do commercial work, you've got to be part of the union. And if you're part of the union, boy, you can only work union jobs. You can't come back and work residential. It's just the way that is. Now, I have one fellow who's on the island now, and has been here, grew up here, and he worked with me for 2 or 3 years, and then he decided he wanted to do commercial. So he went down and spent a year in Tacoma at the union apprenticeship program, and worked for became a journeyman mason and worked for a couple of years, and then decided that he just didn't want to do that, and he came back and then worked for me for another 5 or 6 years. He gave up his union membership and said, "Okay, I'm done with this." So there's not really a back and forth thing. There are many guys who have worked here on the island and have gone to the mainland, Bellingham, Seattle, Everett, and worked for residential contractors that I've been in contact with, and that kind of back and forth, it does happen. You know, I mean, if you're skilled and you have a good recommendation from your boss, you can, at least right now in this economy, you can pretty much go anywhere you want and work.
So you brought up pay scales a little bit. What are typical pay scales?
Well, they typically start between 15 and 17 an hour for a laborer. After a year or two, say after the first year, I raise people up quickly if they perform, because there's no sugarcoating that the work is difficult and challenging, physically challenging. So if you can pay people, you can't really expect good work out of people unless you pay them well. And so after a year or two, after a year they were 20. After 2 years, they were 25, and then they went up from there. When I retired last October, I was paying my top journeyman 35, and the people who were had 3 or 4 years experience were anywhere from 28 to 30. So it's not the top of the scale as an electrician or plumber would be paid. It's an equal or above pay scale to carpenters, which is one of the other main building trades that is available for starting out as a laborer and moving forward. It's certainly a way above sheetrockers and insulators and roofers and a number of the building trades. And I'm incorrect when I say way above, but it's higher than that.
Yeah. And so it sounds like people are typically employed at a larger company. Is that rather than being independent contractors? Is that correct?
No. There's all the masons on the island now have all worked for me at one point, and I trained all of them. And there are several out there that are just one or two men shows. I was the odd man out by having half a dozen or a dozen people. And it's just how that worked out. One of the things that I gave up on when I had that amount of people is that I no longer had a trowel in my hand. I was no longer really working on the job, and I became more of a manager than a tradesman. And that, as you know, it's a double-edged sword. You can't do it both with that amount of people. And But I would say that most of the people on the island are contractors, meaning they have a Washington State contractor's license, which you have to do any work on homes. And they're either one or two guys, or they're a couple guys and one labor. And that's sort of the norm for the island. On the mainland, there are more companies like my company, where you've got half a dozen guys or a dozen guys, and they're doing multiple jobs at one time. Most of the contractors on the island now are doing single jobs at a time, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. There were times that I got spread too thin and couldn't really provide the quality and accuracy that needed to happen. And it was unfortunate at the times, and we had to fix that. But anyway, so a long answer to your short question was that there are any number of ways to do it, but on a small island or a small community, it is typically the one or two man shows that are doing this.
If you're an employee at one of the larger companies, do they typically provide some form of medical or other benefits?
Yeah, they do, and I did. At one point, I provided full medical, and then as the medical costs started to skyrocket, I had to ratchet that down to provide a portion of it. And I think all companies now have to provide a sick leave. And that's a Washington State law now. And I provided, I didn't have great vacation benefits, but I told everybody that it was really important to take some time off, and have a vacation. And so I gave them a lump sum once a year that they, what I gave them was 5 days paid vacation, and they had to use it in one chunk. They couldn't say, call up Friday morning and go, oh, I'm taking a vacation day. So, but again, that's an individual thing. And, the health benefits are always a question and an issue in this day and age. Everybody has their own way they navigate that.
Could you talk a little bit about the physical requirements of the job?
Yeah, so the physical requirements are significant, but they're not really onerous. If you were a block layer and you were laying blocks are 35 pounds a piece, and you would be laying them all day long. And it does take a little bit of work hardening to be able to do that. And it also means that you have to be aware of your body and stretch and do all the things you do to keep it healthy. Brickwork is a little easier because the bricks are smaller, and it's just more of a rhythm. Stonework, the stones are varies in all sorts of sizes, and you could have quite large stones that you're setting, and so you either work with someone else, or you work with hoists, or you work with machines, or you work with block and tackles, or you just really are conscious of what you're lifting. Now, as an entry level thing, you would work as a hod carrier or laborer, and one of the main jobs you would have would be to mix mortar. And so mortar is a mixture of Portland cement and sand and lime. And the difficult part of it, the sand you shovel in and the lime is not very heavy, but the cement bags are 94 pounds. And we would mix half batches, so we'd only use half a bag of cement one at a time. But you still basically have to be able to lift a 94-pound bag of cement, and you have to get it off the truck and put it on the pallet and stuff like that. But that's sort of the upper limit of what you have to do. And it's not, you need to have not only a healthy, strong muscle skeletal system, but you need to be able to be aware of it and maintain it and deal with it. And in the 30 years that I worked, I had back problems. I had elbow problems. I had rotator cuff problems. But all those problems I was able to work through and manage. And I know nobody's working for me, has worked for me, that had, significant, I mean, there were people with significant issues, and all the issues that they had came from, and I hate to say this, but doing something stupid. Unfortunately, our muscles are stronger than our skeletal system, and we can lift things that are stronger than we should. And it's where you have to be aware of what your limitations are, and you have to work smart. That's in this trade and in every trade, is an important part.
What are your favorite aspects of the job?
Well, one of the favorite aspects is when you're building a fireplace, and then it's in the inside of a home, and you're doing all the stone facing, and and you've got it's covered in scaffolding and rocks and old mortar, and you finally get done. But the next job is to acid wash it and take down the scaffolding. And so you start at the top, and then you use a mixture of muriatic acid and water. That takes any of the excess mortar off, or the haze or the scum. And you have a hose in there, and it's one of the few times you get to take a hose into somebody's house. So that's kind of fun. And you wash it down, and you tear the scaffold as you get down. And when you're all done, the scaffold's all taken away from the structure, and it's all clean and it's shiny and wet. And it's the first time you really get to see it complete, without a bunch of stuff in the way. And that's one of my favorite parts.
Are there other things that you think people should know about the masonry careers?
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing, and it was one of the biggest things for me, it was just extremely fulfilling and satisfying to be able to create a structure, create a fireplace, create a stone wall, create a floor, that the clients, they just loved. It was something that gave them joy every time they looked at it. It was a utilization of skill and craft and natural materials that would come together to form a piece. And I like to think of it, or I like to delude myself that at times it approached a large scale sculpture. I think there's very few trades or occupations that give you that type of fulfillment, where you're taking natural materials that are just a pile of stones on the ground, and with your input and your tools and your skill, you can turn them into something that everybody appreciates, and the aesthetics of it are something that give people joy.
Well, thank you very much for coming and talking with us today, and telling us about the masonry trades.
Well, you're welcome, Mickey. It was my pleasure.